We now welcome you to the CCSSAP news broadcast of Part 2 of the Civil War.
Sarah Henderson, Chris Gabriel,
Andrew Chambers,
Cammie Ferguson, Sarah Woolard, Paige Jones.
C.
A. The news team you can trust.
Hi, I'm Sarah Henderson.
And I'm Andrew Chambers.
Coming up on CCSSAP,
News.
also known as Cammie, Chris, Sarah, Andrew, Paige, the Grants Overland campaign is still pushing forward, but the Union is still struggling. People of the Union, I bring you great pleasure to inform you that the Union forces have captured the strategic fort of Vicksburg and have thus opened the Mississippi River to Union trade and other use. Vicksburg was the only thing stopping the Union troops from using the Mississippi River. Joining us now at Vicksburg is Sarah.
Generals Grant, Sherman, McPherson, and McClernand led the Union campaign against this Confederate stronghold. Initially attacking from the Mississippi itself, our generals soon realized that the Confederates had elevation and therefore had an advantage. Union troops then moved around the fort and, using the Mississippi as a border, cornered the troops at Vicksburg. After multiple failed attacks by the Union, Grant and Sherman realized they needed to change their tactics. They dug a mine under the Vicksburg blockade and stuffed it with 2,200 pounds of gunpowder. Once it ignited, the Union troops hoped to rush in and take Vicksburg, but Confederate troops quickly filled the hole that had been blown in their defensive line. After continuous fighting, the Confederates ran out of supplies and were therefore forced to surrender.
Riots have broken out today in New York City. In response to the first federal draft, immigrants in New York have gone on a rampage. January 11th, the first draft list was posted in New York. The draft required 3 years of military service for all able men ages 20 to 45. There's been a lot of controversy about the bounty jumpers. These bounty jumpers have been signing up for the Army, gathering the reward and for joining and then deserting to go away. Men can also pay for a substitute during the war for a fee of $300. Some people call this law the rich man's law, discriminating against the poor. These are very violent riots where death toll is climbing. Here is Sarah live in New York with an update.
Thank you, Sarah. Here in New York, the riots have been escalating. As we approach day 3 of the riots, more and more violence is taking place. Just a few moments ago, a mob of Irish immigrants attacked quite a few blacks here in the city. There have been reports of lynching, burning of black churches, boarding houses, and an orphanage. The mobs have lynched a crippled black coachman. The only thing that will be able to suppress them might just be the military. Back to you, Sarah.
Did you see those dogs?
Those immigrants were such a ride.
Okay.
Yesterday, a devastating calamity occurred. On April 13th, 1864, there was a massive attack on Fort Pillow.
Fort Pillow? Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley. Fort Pillow is located 50 miles above Memphis on the Mississippi River. The garrison occupying the fort was made up of about 600 Union soldiers. The Confederate troop leader, Nathan Bedford Forrest, had control of 3,000 troops. Forrest was told that the blacks in the garrison had gone on frequent raids of the area and that they were harassing women. Reports have confirmed that these reports are most likely untrue and that any harassment would be reported by the local slaveholders who did not like the blacks. The alleged charge is most likely made up to persuade Forrest's troops to attack Fort Pillow and to give a reason why the fort should be attacked.
Forrest demanded that the garrison surrender, and if they did not comply with his order, he was not responsible for the actions of his troops. The garrison thought he was bluffing and refused to surrender. The troops then proceeded to open fire on the troops who had tried to flee. Even after the flag of truce was flown, the Confederate troops continued to attack. At the end of the attack, only 65 blacks remained. The North has called this predestinated slaughter. An eyewitness says that the river looked to be dyed with blood of the slaughtered for 200 miles.
The incredibly drawn-out 3-day Battle of Wilderness caused heavy Union losses. Grant, the first aggressive Union general, is pushing his troops relentlessly towards the Confederate capital of Richmond. His 3-pronged attack on General Hill accounted for many of his losses, but Grant kept pushing right along.
No! Let go of me! No!
Thank you, Sarah. And now to Paige. reporting on the Battle of Spotsylvania.
Thanks, Sarah. The Union continues to push south towards Richmond. The Confederates fight back by chopping down and sharpening tree branches in hopes of slowing down the Union Army from advancing further. The fighting was brutal and vicious. The mutilated bodies were destroyed because of the close-range fighting going on in this battle, but the Union continues to push south and spread themselves thin. Back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Paige. And now to Sarah with an exclusive interview with Union General Grant.
Here with Grant, reporting on the Battle of Cold Harbor. The Union suffered incredibly heavy losses when Grant made a risky attempt to turn towards Petersburg after abandoning his push to Richmond in the Overland Campaign. There was no advantage gained in return for the heavy losses.
I regret that last assault on Cold Harbor. I just wanted to get to that railroad and stop the supplies from getting to those old Confederates.
Back to you, Sarah.
Sherman's troops were absolutely ruthless in Atlanta in their conquest for this great city. Sherman led the Union Army from the north near Peachtree Creek in an effort to cut off the supply roads that provided food and other necessities to the Confederate forces that were held up in Atlanta. At Peachtree Creek, the Union Army divided themselves into 3 squadrons led by Sherman, Thomas, and McPherson. Thomas was placed in charge of cutting off the supply line in the north on the Western and Atlantic Railroad. McPherson was given the responsibility of terrorizing from the east and stopping all trade along the Georgia Railroad. And Sherman had the difficult task of making his way around Atlanta to cut off the Atlanta and West Point Railroad that ran through the south side of Atlanta. After splitting up, Confederate General Hood sent his army north to eliminate Thomas's troop at Peachtree Creek on July 20th, 1864, but suffered a terrible loss of 2,500 men and retreated to Atlanta. He then mobilized troops toward McPherson on the eastern side of Atlanta to reopen the Georgia Railroad on July 22nd. Although McPherson was killed in the battle, the Union troops managed to devastate the Confederate soldiers by killing 8,000 of them. Finally, Hood noticed Sherman troops moving across the western side of Atlanta on July 28th near Urza Church. Sherman pounded Hood back into the confines of the city, thus allowing Sherman to cut off all supplies from the south along the Atlanta and West Point Railroad. However, despite being cut off from all railroads, Hood saw this as a victory. After he sent scouts to where Sherman had been keeping camp and saw that they had left, he declared victory and even held a large ball to celebrate. As he was celebrating, Sherman and Thomas noticed the Confederate troops had given up their blockades, and so they rushed in and took the city of Atlanta. Hood was alerted that Union troops had begun this invasion, and instead of being captured, he fled the city. Sherman and his troops then took everything they wanted from the city and then burned everything else to the ground. Sherman clearly meant that he was ready for total war.
We're here today with General Sherman, just after his march to the sea and his victory in the Carolinas. Sherman, your recent campaign was extremely successful and controversial. Can you tell us about it?
Well, after I captured Atlanta, I talked with General Grant and decided to march my troops to Savannah and then up north to help him defeat Lee. It was a risky idea, but it worked.
So, what exactly did you do?
I left part of my army in Atlanta and took 62,000 of my men down to Savannah with me and divided into the Army of Tennessee and the Army of Georgia and crushed all Confederate resistance in my path.
And you employed a total war policy, correct?
That I did. I sent my soldiers to forage the land and collect anything useful that they could, and including food, anything. And just destroyed all civilian buildings that, well, were in my way.
Why did you choose to cut your supply lines as well?
Well, I figured we could survive by living off the land. If we were harvesting civilian resources, then we didn't need to bring supply lines. Besides, they slowed us down.
That was a very bold move, General. And how was your assault when you finally reached Atlanta?
It was beautiful. We took Fort McAllister and hooked up with the Navy again. Then we surrounded the entire city, and they pretty much gave up.
And after Savannah?
I marched all my troops all the way up to the Carolinas, taking the South Carolina capital, and then defeating Johnston up in, at Bennett Place in Durham, North Carolina.
Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Back to you.
Now, for Weather on the 5s with Chris Gabriel.
It's gonna be sunny.